I love Suits, even though I've actually never, finished the show. What about you, Nick?
I think there's this whole conception that law students have watched Suits. I've never seen one episode.
Really?
No, I'm more of a Law and Order SVU kind of guy.
Okay, yeah. Interesting. I like both, but I feel like as a law student, I see a lot of law students that kind of emulate that Harvey Specter vibe. Okay, let's get started with our introduction. Nick, why don't you introduce us?
You're listening to 99.1 FM on CJAM. Welcome to this week's episode of the Magna Carta Radio Show.
Magna Carta is a show that's run by pro bono students of Canada, and we're speaking as reps from the Windsor chapter of that organization.
PBSC is on a mission to provide free legal support to people and communities facing barriers to justice. With 22 chapters throughout Canada, we are the largest pro bono organization in the country. Our goal with this program is to provide you all with accessible information about relevant legal issues affecting our community.
So before we begin, let's do some introductions. My name is Vurjeet. I attend the University of Windsor Law School. I'm actually from Saskatoon. I'm a prairie girl, but I did my undergrad at the University of Toronto, so I consider myself somebody who's well-versed in the Ontario realm of things too. In terms of law school, I'm in my very first year. I think we just finished our first month, right, Nick?
Yes.
Yeah.
The time is flying.
The time is flying. It's super busy. But yeah. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Awesome. I'm your co-host, Nick. I'm also a 1L at the University of Windsor Law. I grew up between Brampton, Mississauga, and New Brunswick, so
really?
I'm all over the place.
Wow.
Definitely have a passion for fair justice and representation of underrepresented groups. Mm-hmm. And I think we're both super excited to be sharing this podcast with you.
Totally. I feel like my background in journalism, my interest in advocacy for our access to justice has me even more excited to be here today and to talk about some of these really important legal issues.
And speaking of serious and important legal issues, we'd like to offer a content warning. Some of the topics we're going to be discussing today will include content that some listeners might find sensitive and uncomfortable. We'll try to forewarn you about all potentially disturbing content.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Okay, so everybody listening today, we're covering a kind of serious topic, but it's one that's super, super relevant, especially for people in our age group, students within the Canadian university kind of sphere. And so what we're going to cover today is sexual harassment from this legal aspect specifically. So, Nick, I know that you went to U of T for your undergrad, so did I, and I know that you were actually part of a fraternity. Usually I feel like sexual harassment cases, we hear a lot of kind of correlation with fraternities, sororities. So do you have any kind of thoughts on that?
I can totally speak to that, Vurjeet. Me personally, I was never really big on the party scene because of how unsafe it could end up being. People feeling uncomfortable. There's always that discussion of consent.
Yeah.
Alcohol being mixed with partying, it's a slippery slope.
It is.
And especially when these parties aren't really monitored with certain groups. You know, some misconceptions are some fraternities are actually dry.
Oh, really?
So there's no alcohol involved.
I never knew that. Wait, at U of T?
Absolutely. There are a few of them that, aren't that big on the party culture, but for the ones that are, I've heard terrible things. And the access to justice that a lot of, particularly female claimants, have, they're not really heard. And there's a lot of work to be done. And I think it's important that we are sharing avenues to seeking justice and helping people understand their rights.
No, that's great. And I mean, I hope that we at least kind of get a crack at that today. And what you were mentioning, Nick, that really reminds me of the cases that came up at Western University. I think, what was it, like a year or two ago?
I think so. During, homecoming, right?
And I don't know if it was one specifically serious case or like multiple. I mean, I know usually so HOCO, first of all, for everybody, HOCO is kind of like an informal term for homecoming, which is kind of a very large party day that happens at Canadian universities. I know it's very popular at Western. It's very popular at Queen's University. And so usually, from what I've heard, especially from that one incident that happened 2 years ago, there were a lot of cases that came up. And I think one
cases
was
of like sexual
harassment. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And they were pursued, I think, a little bit further, like legally, is from what I remember. And yeah, and so I mean, I remember around the time that it was coming up in the news, this was 2 years ago, I have a really, really close friend at Western. And he was trying to tell me, like, hey, like, come visit, you know, like, come to Hoko. You've never been to Hoko. And not gonna lie, like, I was, I think 22, 21 at the time. I'm 23 now. I'm a young woman. Like, I was afraid. Like, I was like, after hearing all those stories, I was like, not gonna lie, like, this doesn't sound worth it to me. I think I would be, like, paranoid
I
the entire
totally
time.
feel you, and I think that sort of experience is something that transcends homecoming. I mean,
Yeah.
frat row, all of the parties going on at the same time.
Yeah.
And then also, you have to think about like St. Patrick's Day when alcohol is really involved and people are, you know, marching the streets and having a lot to drink, and it can make for some really awful experiences for people.
Definitely. Like, there's so much that could just go wrong in that situation.
Well, I think a lot of people don't really understand what constitutes an assault or harassment, consent, all these really big, important terms. And so I think today we're going to explore laws and just general information surrounding sexual harassment in Canada.
Exactly. That's a great transition. So exactly what Nick said, everyone. Here, we, as law students, we're hoping to cover this topic specifically from a legal perspective, from a legal lens. So what we're hoping to cover with you guys and hopefully clarify is, how is sexual harassment and sexual misconduct defined actually, like under Canadian law? Right? And how do our laws play out in real time? So we're going to cover some cases so that you guys get a better look at how do our laws play out in real time? Are they protecting Canadian citizens? Are they clear enough? Are they not clear enough?
I think another thing, too, is how our laws reflect, you know, our social climate right now.
Totally.
Laws are constantly changing, and I don't think people understand that. Our laws are fluid.
Exactly.
They are broad and overbearing. There's so much to think and talk about. And I think what we'll see in the cases that we cover, that sexual assault, it's not always clear-cut. It's not black and white, and there's a lot of gray area.
No, there is. It can be ambiguous. I feel like if that's one key takeaway I've taken from like this first month of law school, it's that the law is so much more interpretive than I thought it was.
Absolutely, and it's not just the judge's interpretation, it's the lawyer's interpretation and
Totally.
how they argue their cases. It's very interesting stuff.
Especially for something as serious as this, you know, like sexual harassment, like it's not a light topic. We're talking about it right now from a legal lens, but this affects people. Like this stays with people. So making big decisions like that on such a personal kind of traumatic topic, I think it brings to light just how significant this issue is, honestly.
And it takes a lot of courage to bring these sorts of cases and trauma, you know, up.
In the first place, right?
In the first place, you know, victimization surveys reveal an alarming number of Canadians are victims and will be victims of sexual violence. I think in particular, one that I read recently was the Canadian Women's Foundation. They found that among self-reported data, there were about 22 incidents of sexual assault for every 1,000 people.
Like, oh my God. That is...
And those are only the reported cases.
Yeah.
The National Sexual Violence Resource Center found that like 63 or 65% of sexual assaults are not reported to police, and only 12% of child sexual abuse cases are reported to authorities.
My God. Yeah, I mean, even from kind of like what I hear like casually among my peers or among my social circle, like you rarely hear about these things being reported, honestly.
And that's really, really depressing. And there's reasons why, and we'll definitely get into why people might have difficulty reporting these things.
Exactly.
And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that sexual violence disproportionately victimizes children, women, and trans people. And before we get more into the meat of sexual assault law, it's also really important to acknowledge that in a not too distant past, antiquated laws and rules of evidence were extremely misogynistic and made it very difficult for people to advocate for themselves. And there's an abundant amount of evidence suggesting that the criminal justice system is still struggling to deal with sexual violence, especially at the trial level, to have victims express their experiences, especially racialized victims.
Exactly, no. And I think the stigma in South Asian culture, and I'm sure you can speak on this too, Nick, kind of makes these topics even harder to bring up, to report.
It's like a taboo.
Yeah. It's difficult to bring these things up.
So now that we've done a little preamble, I think it's important that we dive into the basics on maybe how we define sexual assault under the code. But first things first, what is the code?
I love this question. Yes. Okay, let's do a super quick crash course. And this will be good for me too, because I feel like I haven't...
We gotta start studying. We've got stuff coming up.
Yeah, assignments every day. Haven't really gotten into exam prep much, so this is good for me too. But okay, everybody, let me bless you with some information. So in Canada, the way the division of powers kind of works between our provincial powers and our federal powers is that the criminal offenses are all set under the federal realm. So if something's a crime and has a punishment, that is not a provincial it's not under the provincial jurisdiction. So what that means, for our topic specifically, is that what counts as sexual harassment in Saskatchewan is the exact same as what counts as sexual harassment in Nova Scotia.
So what you're saying is that the federal government sets out the rules.
Yeah, the federal government sets out the rules. It's the same within the country. So our criminal code is kind of this rule book of all the crimes that are set out as crimes in Canada, right? So for sexual assault specifically, we see that in sections 272 of the code. And I should have brought my little book with me right now. I don't have it on me. But so under section 272, sexual assault is defined under 3 possible terms. So the first is with a weapon. The second is as a threat to a third party. And the third is causing bodily harm. And again, we're talking about this like it's really clear cut. Sometimes it can be both of these things. Sometimes it can be all 3. It can be a mix. It's not always clear, right? And then within this law that's set out in the code about defining sexual assault, we also see 5 subsections about sexual assault. So I'm going to list these out for you guys right now, just because I do think that defining it exactly the way that it's set out in the code is useful for us. So the first subsection is carries, uses, or threatens to use a weapon or an imitation of a weapon. B is threatens to cause bodily harm to a person other than the complainant. So there might be a third party involved, basically. C is causes bodily harm to the complainant. That's kind of the direct way.
And even the terms like bodily harm, that can be interpreted in so many different ways.
Definitely. Different judges see bodily harm in different ways, right?
Yep. The wording is paramount.
Yeah, very ambiguous, yeah. And then our 4th subsection is chokes, suffocates, or strangles the complainant. That's a bit more straightforward, actually. I'm surprised that there's a subsection. Oh, I guess it's C.1. So that's under bodily harm. Mm-hmm. And then the 5th subsection we have is a party to the offense with any other person.
The next aspect of sexual assault we're going to define is the way the code handles consent. According to sections 271, 272, and 273, consent is defined as voluntary agreement to the complainant to engage in sexual activity in question. The code does specify what doesn't count as consent, and that's in section 273, subsection 2. And there are a couple scenarios that I think we should all be aware of. So the first one for what doesn't count as consent is an agreement is expressed by words or conduct of a person other than the complainant. So that's usually the accused. Maybe they're saying that they want to do something XYZ, and the complainant doesn't have anything to say. The second sort of scenario would be if the complainant is unconscious. And this really ties into a lot of that party culture that we were talking about before, Vurjeet. Like, when people are drinking, sometimes you might say that you're interested at some point, but if you fall asleep, you change your mind. Consent is over.
Consent's over if a person is blacked out. Okay, guys?
Take that away, please.
Key takeaway.
So another really important one is when someone is abusing their power. So someone who's in a position of trust or authority and is trying to engage in acts that would pressure you, would make you feel pressured.
Totally. And honestly, even this scenario, there's so many different type of relationships that could potentially be there.
So like your boss and an employee.
Boss, employee. Another relationship that's come up in some of my classes is like the relationship between like kind of medical, like somebody in a medical role. So like, for example,
like a caretaker?
A caretaker, a nurse of some sort, especially if there's, somebody senior involved, like then they're spending a lot of time together. So that's a position of trust as well. Mm-hmm.
And another thing that doesn't codify as consent is when the complainant or the victim, by words or by their conduct, expresses like a lack of agreement. The biggest one, of course, is saying no.
Of course, yeah. There's no, but then also, and this is important, guys, is if there's not a clear yes, if there's a maybe, if there's a level of uncertainty, and I don't want to get into a whole lecture on consent right now, but
it's important, and we also have to see, like we talked about before, once consent ends, it's real clear. It's yes, Crystal, and if there's an or,
then
it's over.
Yeah, totally. Right, and so while we're discussing these definitions, it's really important to note that Canadian law is constantly changing. We mentioned this before, but we really want to hone in on this point. Our previous laws weren't always the best representative of the experiences of victims. Importantly, Parliament has enacted measures to regulate the extent to which a complainant's confidential records, medical or psychiatric, for example, can be disclosed. This is an example. This is a triumphant step in the betterment of victim treatment because in the past, victims' personal records were often used against them.
And when we watch shows like Law & Order SVU, and they pull people on the stand and they really go in at them, when it's something as particular and as sensitive as sexual assault, bringing someone's past experiences up, it can be detrimental to that person's mental health and their ability to advocate for themselves.
No, of course, especially when those topics are discussed so especially in a legal aspect, they're discussed very kind of coldly, there's not a lot of emotion when we're talking about things from the legal aspect. But yeah, I guess what I was trying to say is that Canadian law is not really set in stone at all. It's not isolated to whatever's in the code, and we see that with this precedent that's constantly being set, new cases, new scenarios that come up, new decisions that are made that help us make future decisions, right? And so this kind of builds on the bigger doctrine that, again, this is a good 1L review for us. 1L is first year law school. About the living tree doctrine. So the living tree doctrine is this doctrine in the Canadian law system that acknowledges the fact that our law adapts and it changes with the times. As new problems arise, and a great example of this is AI, right? But as new problems arise, new scenarios arise, new interpretations of our law also arise. So I guess that's really important with these types of cases as well.
Yeah, totally. The progression of sexual assault law specifically has been extremely successful in the past few decades. And this is really the result of, feminist legal scholarship and advocacy that has driven important social change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And some of these important reforms include also the removal of spousal immunity in cases of sexual assault, right? And the development of statutory limits on examining a complainant's sexual history and the redefinition of consent as well.
Yep. The advances of our criminal law in reference to sexual assault, they provide a sense of protection from problematic excesses of the past. I mean, having spousal immunity in discussion of sexual assault,
Yeah.
taking away someone's power like that and doing horrible things. It's insane to think that only a few decades ago that was seen as law, that was fair.
Like, honestly, I'm so glad things are progressing. And, an argument could be made that maybe they aren't progressing quickly enough. But I guess this is at least...
I'd have to, chip in and say I kind of agree. We
Yeah.
still have some major roadblocks in providing, equitable access to justice for complainants.
Definitely.
For instance, like the determination of facts,
Right.
including the credibility of witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
We are really presented with a distinct issue in the context of sexual assault involving credibility, which contests largely like between the female complainant and putting
Right.
so much onus on that person
Yeah.
to a largely male accused pool. Okay, so we've been throwing a lot of legal jargon at you. The terms like complainant, accused, assault, consent, and I think it's really worth seeing how these laws played out in real time. So we're going to take some time to explore a couple cases, both of which have explored the role of consent. And before we start, I want to offer that content warning. We're going to be discussing some things that are a bit sensitive and possibly uncomfortable. So the first case we're going to talk about is the Crown and Kirkpatrick. So Vurjeet, give us the rundown. What happened? What are the facts of the case?
Okay, yeah, totally. So in my case brief for class, I keep little letters for their names to keep my notes short. So here today we're gonna call the girl Jane and we're gonna call the guy John.
That is so imaginative.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you. I'm a very creative lady. Okay, so let's get into the facts. So Jane and John, they met online. They were chatting it up, and then they decided to meet in person. And they discussed if they wanted to have a sexual relationship, if they wanted to engage in sex. And Jane had made it very clear to John that she would have sex on a condition. And that condition was that he would have to wear the condom, right? So...
and he agreed to that in the first time that they had sex.
He agreed, yeah. Okay. So
Okay.
there was a first time, they had it, everything was fine. But then on the second instance, John didn't wear a condom. But Jane had only found this out after ejaculation had already...
So he didn't tell her about that at all? So there was there's nothing about that?
No.
Okay.
That's kind of the tricky part of this case.
And how does that become illegal? What is the legal issue here? And where does the law come in?
Right, great question. So this case honestly brought up a really interesting question of where do we draw the line on what counts as consent, right? And we talked about that definition, but even within that definition that we discussed earlier, this case is put in kind of a gray area. So did the girl, Jane, did she consent to sex in this situation? Is the usage of the condom equivalent to what we are considering sex in this situation? Did a crime happen here? And let's say we say that consent was there, then does the situation constitute as an instance where there was an aspect of fraud within sexual assault, an aspect of being misled, right? So there's a lot of kind of legal questions in this one. Yeah, but I guess now that we've set out the story here, Nick, what do you think? This case is kind of a tricky one, right?
I feel like it's tricky on the outside, but once you take a look at it, and I'm sure we're going to see what the judges had to say about this, but I don't know if she consented to have sex with the condition of having the condom on.
Yeah.
Was that something that was continuous throughout the relationship?
Yeah.
Did she reinstate that? Or was he under the impression that
changed?
It's changed.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of gray area, like we talked about. There's so much ambiguity in the facts. So.
Yeah, and I guess my opinion on this is definitely that if a condition was mentioned once, I guess my thought process is that it would stay. But again, that's an opinion, right?
That's an opinion. Yep, it's subjective.
It's subjective.
But yeah, you touched on fraud, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that John might have abuse his position of trust with Jane because he had agreed previously to her condition of wearing the condom.
Honestly, and we're talking about this candidly, we'll get into the judge's decisions later, but honestly, like, when I hear the facts of this case and when I read it for the first time, that's what I thought. Like, I was like, this does kind of feel like a situation, an abuse of trust is what it feels like. If you agreed to something and you knew it was a condition.
If someone vehemently, like, told you this is the only way,
yeah,
why would that have changed? So...
yeah.
There are arguments for both sides, but I'm really interested to know what the judges had to say about this.
Yeah, and it does seem actually, if we're talking about the decision now, that the judges seem to agree with our opinion. But the thing is that the judges were very split on this case. So the majority agreed with what we're talking about right now, but it was a very split case.
And that makes it really interesting to look at because there are so many different opinions to wager into a final decision, a binding decision in law. So
exactly, yeah. When judges are split on a case, I think that speaks to how the case is very interpretive and it's not straightforward. And so this is an example of that. But yeah, so the majority here, basically, they were discussing about whether the act of wearing the condom, is it seen as within the act of having sex or if it's seen as separate, right? Because that's not set out in the code. And like I mentioned, the majority, they decided that the condom would be included in what we're defining as the sexual activity. So consenting to sex, basically, that would mean in this situation, in this context, consenting to condom use too. So then the conclusion that we come to from that is that the girl did not consent to the sex.
Because the condom was not used.
Exactly.
And that upheld the sexual assault charges.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically it came down to consent. We didn't even have to get to the point of fraud because majority agreed that this wasn't what Jane had consented to in the first place. Mm-hmm.
Now let's take a look at a second case. An older Supreme Court case from 1999, the Crown and Iwanchuk. A case of implied consent, which is basically consent that isn't given explicitly, and we covered this in our definition of consent beforehand. So it's important to note that the Supreme Court cases, like in the name, are supreme in Canada. And it also means that this case has gone through several appeals in lower court. And in this case, like many others within the brevity of sexual assault cases, it's extremely complex. In this case, the complainant was a 17-year-old woman that was interviewed by the accused for a job in his van. However, to my surprise as well, the alleged assault did not take place in this van job interview.
Okay, so what kind of interview was this? I feel like going into somebody's van for an interview, I don't know, it kind of seems like a dangerous idea.
Maybe that's just our Toronto street smarts talking, but there was definitely some lapses in judgment.
Maybe, yeah.
So the complainant actually said that she felt safe in the moment, even saying that the interview was quite businesslike and polite.
In the van?
In the van. But they actually moved out of the van when the complainant asked to smoke a cigarette.
Okay, this is giving a very informal vibe, very
it is.
Casual.
And you want to know, the accused actually picked up the complainant from a mall with her friend, and then the next day she agreed to do her little interview with him.
In the van.
So in the van, without her friend being present.
Really?
So this is a couple days, and this is an older gentleman picking up girls who are underage.
Right. And she's a 17-year-old,
yep.
right?
And this is where things took a turn after she went out for that cigarette. Mm-hmm. Because the accused asked her if she wanted to see some of his work that was in the trailer that he was towing with his van. And for context, the accused was a woodworker, and the girl was applying to sell his products in a market setting.
Okay, I see. Interesting.
Yep. And she did purposely leave the door open when she walked into the trailer, but the accused shut it almost immediately.
Oh my God. That would have been a major red flag for me right off the bat. I would be like running out. But
and what would you do? I mean, if someone older than you and in a position of power
shut
a door in a trailer, a smaller trailer, you would feel like maybe you had just like something ripped away from you. Your
A sense of safety, right?
exactly.
Yeah, like, I don't know. If I was in that situation, immediately this would feel like, okay, I have to be
This
on
is
alert.
fight or flight.
This
This
is,
is
yeah.
this is scary.
Yeah.
And according to the facts of the case, the 17-year-old girl was under the impression that the doors had been locked.
Okay.
And the conversation in the trailer, while it had begun from like a professional sort of standpoint of looking at his work, it allegedly had become extremely personal within, 15 minutes. Again, not so professional.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our show. My name's Vurjeet. I'm here with my co-host, Nick. We're both first-year law students, and right now you're listening to Magna Carta, which is a show run by the Pro Bono Students of Canada, and we're speaking on behalf of the Windsor chapter at the University of Windsor Faculty of Law's organization. Today we're covering kind of a sensitive topic, and it might not be suitable for all audiences. We're discussing sexual harassment, and where we left off was we were discussing one of the cases. Mm-hmm.
A Supreme Court case called The Crown and Iwanchuk.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, we had just summarized the preamble before the alleged assault. So
Right.
a 17-year-old girl goes for a job interview in someone's van, and afterwards, he invites her into his trailer to look at some of his work. He was a woodworker. She was applying to sell his products, and that's where things took a turn. So, like we said before, the conversation in the trailer started from professional, showing his work, to a bit too personal, in about 10 to 15 minutes. The accused initiated a number of incidents involving touching.
A number of incidents. So, did she consent to these? Did she say yes?
No, she did not.
Okay.
In the facts of the case, she kept saying no to every single one of his initiations.
Hmm.
And I think you can see where consent might be starting to factor into this case.
Yeah.
So, this case specifies the concept of implied consent, which is what the trial judge used to acquit the accused of his sexual assault charges. So, implied consent is basically consent that was not given directly. So, in his mind, you look into the accused's mind, you'll see, okay, well, this girl went into my van, she went into my trailer, we're
Right.
talking and whatnot. But do you think something like that would fly today?
I'm going to be honest, I don't.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Consent
Yeah.
is something that has to be maintained. And that's what makes this case a landmark case. This case had the capability to change what we knew as the right way to understand consent. So in this Supreme Court case, the judges had to find if the trial judges had made an error in their understanding of consent and sexual assault.
This is a big case.
It is, and they found that the trial judge was indeed wrong, and that implied consent is not a valid defense. We need to understand that a conviction of sexual assault requires the proof beyond reasonable doubt of the actus reus, which is, in this case, the unwanted touching. So the act. Actus reus is the act.
Mm-hmm.
And then the mens rea, the intention.
Right.
And in this case, the accused had the intention to touch, and it was reckless touching with a willful lack of consent by the
Yeah.
person afflicted, which was the 17-year-old girl. So the judges were able to establish proof of touching, the sexual nature of the touch, and the absence of consent.
Right. So, well, the first two elements are objective, right? The Crown was able to prove, and the accused was open about the touching. That's why his counsel used the implied consent as a defense, right?
Exactly. And no defense of implied consent to sexual assault exists in Canadian law.
Okay.
The victim's fear is protected under Section 265.3 of the Criminal Code, which, includes the submission by reason of force, fear, and exercises of authority. And we were talking about that earlier, that breach of trust, that breach of authority to be in a power position. And that's exactly what the accused was in. So, consent is an integral part of the mens rea, the intent of the accused and the intent of the victim too.
Totally.
Yeah. The victim never consented to engage in sexual activity, and the judges rightly found that the belief of the accused in his mind to touch her without consent was an expression of his own desire. That's not a defense for sexual assault. And this is such an important case because it counters myths and stereotypes, fallacies of consent, and implied behaviors. It states that consent must be communicated before and throughout any kind of sexual activities. And I think this does contribute to what we talked about in The Crown and Kirkpatrick.
Right.
Because consent has to be continuous and throughout all kinds of sexual activities.
It has to be maintained. Yep. It's not just a one-time thing, and it has to be very clear.
Yes. And the previous trial judges led with assumptions.
Right.
But the Supreme Court led with the law.
Okay, so then the Supreme Court overturned the acquittals?
Absolutely. So, like we said before, the Supreme Court is the top dog of all courts in Canada. So we had our trial, we had our appeal, because the 17-year-old girl and her counsel, they appealed the initial acquittal of the accused. And the respondents could not come up with a plausible defense. And the Crown was really successful here.
Right.
Stereotypical assumptions that are inherently misogynistic no longer find a place in Canadian law. And that is amazing. It's a prime example of how Canadian law can change, and it's an expression of its fluidity.
Right. It's an example of what we were talking about, that living tree doctrine, the fact that these cases that are setting precedent, they're setting rules that we're going to follow in the future, right?
And there are tons of assumptions that the Canadian justice system has had to work through. I mean, if consent was debated, there have to be tons of menial defenses that have to be counteracted. Otherwise, people would get away with some horrible things.
Definitely.
And what are some assumptions that you can think of, or just like one that comes off the top of your head?
Kind of some. Are you talking more about like assumptions and defenses, potential defenses? Yeah. I mean, so one that I know you and I were discussing, which actually goes really hand in hand with what we were talking about earlier, is intoxication. The role of any type of substance that leaves a person inebriated. Yeah. How does that play into the role of consent and sexual assault, right?
It plays into everything related to that. And I think everyone that has been to a house party or in a party setting or at a bar where drinks are available and have been involved, we can really relate to ideas of intoxication. So when you start to drink or, other substances are taken or partaken in, you can see people not have full control of themselves.
Yeah.
And that's what people might think is a defense. But a defense of intoxication is not just about being drunk or high. It's that control aspect. And the Supreme Court of Canada is super clear that drunkenness is not a defense for crimes of violence, especially sexual assault. Intoxication or a state of like extreme drunkenness that impacts your ability to do things is not a defense to criminal conduct in most cases. And you really have to stress in most cases because, like we said, interpretation is everything.
Context is everything.
Yep. And then there's something called like self-caused automatism. So it's like you induced yourself to this state. You had too much to drink.
Right.
And for the most part, people do know what too much is.
Yeah, they know their limits.
That's why we have things like the Smart Serve. We have people that should be able to tell people, you need to stop drinking or else you could be liable to do some horrible things.
Exactly. Like being inebriated does not kind of set you aside from the responsibility of your actions.
But unfortunately, just because intoxication causing these things, just because the substance might cause something, and people understand that, it's not a valid defense in this context. It doesn't stop it from disproportionately affecting violence against women and youth. So women and children, like we noted, are often the victims of sexual violence for them. And this is even more common experience for Indigenous women, girls, and members of the LGBTQ community. But that's for a whole other podcast.
It is, yeah. But honestly, I'm glad that you mentioned it still, because understanding that these topics are not we can't view these topics in a vacuum. Right? Like there are so many other aspects that like intersect, right? Race, like you're mentioning.
Even classism, because
Low,
you know,
being,
if we're talking about like a workplace environment, that that could really impact how you're treated and how you respond to things.
exactly.
Maybe you can't, in those power imbalance situations, you might not be able to, communicate your consent because you might be afraid that you'll lose your job, or you're afraid that something bad will happen to you. And that fear is what is protected in the criminal code.
Right.
So there are safety nets in the criminal code for people who are struggling like this. And it's important to talk about that.
And, Nick, you're bringing up this role of power relations and, the workplace. I think this is a great transition into another kind of defense, which is also...
Defense that isn't a defense.
Yeah, defense that isn't a defense, that's negligence, right? So negligence is kind of this concept that ties in with duty of care, right? Especially when we're talking about in the workplace, there's a duty of care from that organization to look after its employees, right? And this really ties in with the regulations that you might see internally within a company. So usually HR will always have their own kind of standards, right? They will set out like sexual assault is not something that can happen here, all that.
Have you ever had to deal with something like that, or do you know of anything that's happened?
I haven't, but actually one of my majors at U of T was HR. So a lot of what we talked about was these workplace expectations, how you would handle this type of case, like within...
There's all sorts of training that's becoming more accessible now, and I think that's
Totally.
important. I can attest to working at a grocery store, for instance, and we had a lot of workers who were migrant workers, lower class individuals, and they were often exploited. And there was one person in particular that would, target younger girls, and he was very predatory.
Really?
And he would make everyone uncomfortable. He made me feel uncomfortable in certain instances too. And what kind of is like the saving grace is that our HR was swift to remove that.
See, the role of HR is so important. And it's important to also discuss like certain, like usually bigger companies, bigger corporations, they've got these standards set. But think about the number of companies that are smaller, right? Especially those small businesses you have, 10, 15, 20 people.
Not even. It could be just the owner and you.
Yeah.
Who do you go to when something goes wrong?
I'm not going to lie, you don't have anybody
and
to
I
go
think
to.
we really need to stress the importance of knowing your rights as a victim.
Great, yeah. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that is something also that we really want to touch on this episode. Today we've been talking about sexual misconduct, like I mentioned, with that legal lens, but this is far from just just a topic.
The law should not be something that is so pulled apart from
the personal
mainstream
experience.
Society, because what we are covering, the sort of topics that we're discussing, like Vurjeet has said in the past, these are real. These are individuals' experiences.
Exactly. So approaching this topic logically, it takes away from how personal the topic is, right? And so that's why we do want to take a moment just to discuss, if you find yourself as a listener in this situation, we want to just cover what are your rights, right? So if harassment has occurred in your workplace, like we mentioned, and, you are in a situation where you have access to HR, I think that is a great first step, especially if you're kind of feeling iffy on if you want to move forward with this.
So, Vurjeet, what's a brief of the role of the HR person? Is this someone that works with everyone? Is it personal? Is it anonymous? And what exactly do they do for people?
Right. So obviously it depends company to company, their standards. Hopefully, the standards are set out clearly in a way that really protects the employee. And, in the companies that I've worked at, they have been. Usually there's a way to file a claim that is
internal, right?
Internal, that is confidential, it protects you, and you have the decision-making power in that entire process, right? Because stripping the employee's power away is after an experience like this. That's like the last thing you want in this situation, right?
It's traumatic, and if you are in a circumstance where maybe your HR is not advocating for you, or you feel like things are not going properly,
Yeah.
it's really important to know that in Ontario, you can file a human rights claim through the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. And for more information, you guys should visit their website at www.hrto.ca.
Right. So for a claim that you'd like to proceed with, something more serious, maybe it wasn't handled properly within your workplace, or you don't even feel like you had the resources in your workplace, and it's a serious claim, you can go to the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. Yep. And then let's say you need legal help with a human rights application. You can also contact the Human Rights Legal Support Center, and their website is www.hrlsc.on.ca. So if you find yourself in need of a lawyer, in need of advocacy, within Ontario, you have access to that as well.
And also, I'm not sure if it transcends or goes into sexual assault cases, but for legal aid, the University of Windsor Law Faculty does offer that program CLA,
Right.
which is Community Legal Aid, and they are extremely helpful. And
Helpful.
I believe it's pro bono work as well.
Yeah, we have so many peers that work within the clinic. I'm not sure if they handle this type of case, but that's a really good point. Yeah.
So definitely
something
look
to
into
look
that.
into.
And since most of us are university students, the University of Windsor has implemented a prevent, resist, and support policy in the discussion of sexual violence. The campaign and policy does appear to be a bit generic, but it does vehemently state that it's in its belief of victim testimony. And it does offer young women comprehensive sexual assault resistance education through a program they call Flip the Script with the EAAA program. They've also partnered with the Wendo Women's Self-Defense and Acts of Resistance to offer self-defense training both online and in person. And to contact the Office of Sexual Violence Prevention, Resistance and Support, you can email svssupport@uwindsor.ca. Again, that's svssupport@uwindsor.ca. Or you can find the form on the UWindsor Sexual Violence website.
And we know we're throwing a lot of kind of processes in your face right now, but it's important to know that filing a claim, going through the legal processes, it can be so much to handle alongside the emotional trauma and maybe the physical trauma, right, after experiencing sexual harassment. So remember that it's up to you and only you if you want to move forward with this legally or in whatever capacity. But with that said, a point I really, really want to stress, if there's one takeaway that you get from this episode, please let it be the fact that if you've experienced something, if you experience some type of situation of sexual misconduct, please know that it is worth reaching out to a trusted loved one, whether that be a friend, whether that be a sibling, anybody that you trust, maybe a teacher of some sort, somebody to confide in. Know that you are not alone.
And know that whatever you have gone through, there are pathways for help through our government, through our law. There are tangible ways in which you can, reclaim your power.
Right.
And on a more personal note, I think me and Vurjeet can both attest to the fact that it's a bit depressing that the university is clear that sexual assault is bound to occur, and that our victimization surveys say that, lots of people will and are sexual assault survivors. It's something that affects people from all walks of life, and it disproportionately affects minority groups.
Right.
Sexual assault in the Canadian purview is wrong, in my opinion, but it says it's wrong. But in my opinion, I hate the fact that it's seen as inevitable, and that's where I find issue. Why do people feel that they can conduct themselves in a way that takes away the power of others, to harm them? Is it because the criminal justice system is not doing enough to counteract this behavior, to punish it? These are questions that we should be asking our legislatures, our professors, anyone in positions of power, because women, children, and minority groups should not have to do more to be less of a victim when they are faced with sexual violence.
I so agree with that, especially with these cases. So many times, the onus is on the victim. Imagine going through the trauma and then also having to literally review your advice, review your text, review whatever you had, and bring it all up to the surface again.
And you have to become your own advocate. Becoming an advocate for yourself after a crime has been committed against you. And like you said, that it's just heart-wrenching.
Mm-hmm. Okay, everybody. Today we've covered a lot. We talked about the criminal code. We discussed how those crimes in Canada are under the federal jurisdiction, right? Then we also talked about how sexual assault and consent are defined under that criminal code. We talked about 2 cases that kind of exemplified the way the definition specifically of consent isn't really clear-cut. It can be interpreted in different ways, right? And we also discussed this idea of the living tree doctrine, right? The idea that the law in Canada is based on precedent and not just what is written in our criminal code, what's written in our books. The decisions that are made in the past and how times change, really, they change the way that our law works, the way that decisions are made in the future.
We also covered defenses against sexual assault and why those aren't defenses. So intoxication, negligence, implied consent. These are things that are not okay and cannot be used as a defense in the court of law anymore. So those 2 cases that we talked about, those are landmark cases. Those are it's a big deal. And your choices in how to file a claim if you're a victim of sexual abuse, assault, harassment, there are avenues for you to get help. And like Vurjeet stressed, it's really important that, and we really hope that you have some sort of support system to help you through challenging times like this, because we can recognize that this is a very traumatic and enduring process. It's a sensitive process.
Yeah. Okay. And on that kind of serious note, I guess, we still want to take a moment and thank you, whoever's listening out there. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed learning about these legal topics as much as we enjoyed chatting about this topic. Even though it was heavy, I think it's a very, very important topic. I'm glad that we were able to take time to research for this episode. I really think this was educational for me, and hopefully it's educational for anybody who's out there listening.
It was great at reinstating some of the concepts that we're going to have to draw on as law students, as potential
for
lawyers.
Our exams, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, guys. I'm Vurjeet.
And I'm Nick, and this is us signing off from the PBSC's Magna Carta on 99.1 FM on CJAM Radio.